In the late 16th century, the Spanish Conquistadors encroaching into Asia under the orders of their king Philip II, and groups of Chinese, Japanese, Wako pirates clashed over the Philippines and its riches at the Battle of Cagayan.
Mabuhay or in Kapampangan, luwid kayo. Welcome back to my channel. It's me, Kirby Araullo, your friendly Pinoy historian. And if you are new to my channel, in this channel, I make videos about our people's history, our people's culture, and everything in between. So don't forget to like, share this video, comment down below, and please subscribe. So for today's video, as many of you requested, I'll be doing a reaction or a commentary to the animated video The Battle of Cagayan, Conquistadors vs. Samurai documentary by the amazing channel Kings and Generals. Overall, I actually enjoyed the video. As always, Kings and Generals did a great job in their presentation. I really liked the animation, although I saw some minor inaccurate things such as in the maps, but overall I think it's a great introduction into this fascinating yet little known battle. So in this video today, I'm not gonna go too much into details about the things that they already mentioned in their video. But just like last time, we'll be looking at the different parts of the video and see if I have anything to add or if things are true or false. And these are based on the questions, the messages, and the comments I got from many of you, my beloved viewers and subscribers. So, did this epic battle really happen? Was there really a battle, an epic battle between a handful of conquistadors versus 1,000 samurais? Let's learn more. So in the video, they mentioned how Aparri was established as a Japanese city-state on the tip of northern Luzon, on the mouth of the mighty Cagayan River. And from what we know, there was indeed a Japanese settlement in Aparri surrounding a castle during the late 1500s. It was said to be led by the pirate captain Taifusu or Taifusa, and it had about 600 residents who traded with the indigenous people of the Cordilleras and the Cagayan Valley. For example, they exchanged their weapons for gold from the indigenous Igorot. And as mentioned in the video, these so-called Japanese pirates were actually not all Japanese. It was a multi-ethnic community made up of both East Asians and Southeast Asians, and they were known as the Woku Pirates. And their flourishing settlement in Aparri was discovered by the Spaniards in 1581, and they called it Puerto de Japon, aka the Japanese port. And then the Spanish colonial government decided that this settlement had to disappear, that it must be eradicated through military intervention. They want to get rid of it, even though Japanese trading presence in this part of northern Luzon actually predates the arrival of the Europeans. It is also worth noting that this settlement was not an official colony of Japan, but rather a community built together by the Woku pirates and Japanese merchants. So in this video, they actually gave an animated introduction, a brief introduction, and a simplified background on the history of early Japanese presence in the history of the Philippines. But in this channel, we dig deeper, so let's dig deeper. Way before this battle in 1581, the Japanese were already active as both merchants and pirates in pre-colonial Philippines. For example, when the Ming dynasty of China closed its doors to maritime trade, the Kingdom of Luzon, centered in what is now Tondo and Manila, was granted an exception and therefore had the monopoly of Chinese trade between the 1400s and the 1500s. So people from all over East Asia and Southeast Asia would gather in Manila Bay to access Chinese products. And they brought it throughout Southeast Asia, in places like the Sultanates of Malacca and Brunei. In fact, the Luzones were often mistaken to be Chinese themselves because they were the only ones who had access to these commodities. And this ban on maritime trade by the Ming dynasty actually resulted in increased Japanese piracy. The Japanese merchants were basically forced to change their methods from official trading with China, with the ports of China, to illegal piracy in order to retain their access to these highly sought-after products from China. And perhaps the most famous among them was Naya Sukizaimon, who later changed his name to Luzon Sukizaimon after the island and the kingdom of Luzon. Direct trading between the Japanese and the kingdoms of pre-colonial Philippines was also flourishing for centuries before colonialism. Our ancestors and the Japanese have always had a strong connection way before Europeans even reached either of the archipelagos. They enjoyed centuries of trading and political connections that are often overlooked and forgotten in today's narrative of Philippine history. And I've actually been planning on making a video, or several videos actually, about this topic, about this forgotten early history about, between the Japanese and our pre-colonial ancestors. I just haven't found the time to make them yet, but I guess this video is actually a great start. So stay tuned for more, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button, that notification bell, and so you don't miss out when those videos come out. Now back to our topic, back to the Battle of Cagayan. So in their video, the Battle of Cagayan, Conquistadors versus the Samurai, kings and generals, they actually did a pretty good job in giving us an overview of the events according to the two surviving letters or primary sources. Now, these two letters don't actually talk about what happened before or after the events surrounding the battle. They're actually very limited, so we actually have to look at other sources. We have to balance both historical records from the Philippines and Spain and even other countries around us, and, critically balance it with the oral traditions of our own people. And so many of you have asked me what happened after the battle. After the Battle of Cagayan, the Japanese merchants were actually allowed to trade in the capital city of Manila itself. They were allowed to keep their trade missions and even settle in Manila. In fact, we have eyewitness accounts stating that many survivors from this Japanese community in Cagayan who went to trade in Manila after the settlement in Aparri was destroyed. By 1585, just a few years after the battle, the Spanish colonial government established a separate district called Dilao to house the growing Japanese community in Manila. The Spaniards claimed that they were growing too large and too difficult to control, and so they needed to limit their presence within the district called Dilao. Dilao in Kapampangan in Tagalog means yellow. And if you think about it, it was practically their own little Japantown or little Tokyo in the city of Manila. And for the most part, this Japanese community in Manila was pretty much internally independent and thriving. And as mentioned, the early settlers of Dilao were the same people who survived the destruction of their settlement in Aparri during the Battle of Cagayan. So, in other words, the Spaniards did not really want to eradicate the presence of these Japanese traders in the Philippines, but instead, they just wanted to control them, to keep an eye on them. Today, Dilao is known as the modern district of Paco in Manila. And today, you can still visit a plaza called Plaza Dilao in Paco, Manila, where there is actually a statue of a historic Japanese daimyo and samurai named Justo Takayama Ukon. But, this is actually not the first Japanese settlement in Manila, and definitely not the first Japanese community in what is now the Philippines. For example, when the Spaniards returned to the Philippines in the 1560s, almost 5 decades after the death of Magellan in the Battle of Mactan in 1521, there was already a thriving community of Japanese traders in Manila. And Manila was then ruled by my own ancestors, Raja Matanda, then known as the King of Luzon, and his nephew, the Raja Muda or Crown Prince, Raja Sulaiman of Maynila. And these Japanese merchants in the city of Manila also included Christian Japanese. So yes, Christianity was already present in Luzon way before it was conquered by the Spaniards in the 1570s. Christianity was already present in the city of Manila when it was still a Muslim-walled city. So yes, Christians and Muslims have coexisted in the city of Manila when it was still a Muslim kingdom, way before it became the colonial capital of the Philippines, way before it was conquered by Spain. And actually, if you remember from my earlier videos, the Japanese were also part of this epic Pan-Asian conspiracy to drive out the Spaniards from the Philippines. It is known to us today as the Revolt of the Lacans or the Tondo Conspiracy of 1587 to 1588. And it was led by the Lacans and the Datus of Luzon. It was started by the then ruler of Tondo, Agustin de Legazpi, and his cousin Martin Pangan. And these leading figures also included the nephews of Raja Matanda, the sons of Lacandula himself, Magat Salámat of Tondo, Datu Dionisio Capulong of Candaba, Datu Felipe Salonga of Palo, along with their cousins, the adopted sons of Raja Sulaiman of Maynila, and Agustin de Legazpi's own brothers, Datu Gabriel Tuambasan and Datu Jeronimo Basi. And many other datus from the different parts of the Philippines would also join soon after, from the present-day provinces of Pampanga, Bulacan, Batangas, Laguna, Mindoro, Palawan, Sulu, and even Brunei. It was epic, but equally tragic. So if you want to learn more about this, epic conspiracy, this often forgotten chapter of Asian history involving not just the Philippines but also East Asia like Japan and Southeast Asia like Brunei, against the Spaniards, against the colonizers, check out the links up here or down below from our older videos about this epic Tondo conspiracy or the revolt of the Lacans. I made it both in English and Tagalog, so, choose your own language. And actually, before I forget, I actually wrote about this in my book, Know Our Roots #1, Tondo, Slavery, and the Revolt of the Lacans. So if you want to learn more about it, dig deeper beyond the videos that I make, check out my books in the links down below. I also have some graphics, illustrations, both chibis, and some maps. Ayan. Actually here. Yan, si Magat Salámat and Junicio Capulong and his cousins. But anyways, back to our topic. The biggest question in this video is, is it true that only a handful of Spanish conquistadors defeated hundreds of Japanese pirates? Now, this is actually a bit tricky to answer because the available sources, the two letters that we know, kinda contradict each other. And both of them are actually full of egos and boasting. So the details of how they defeated the pirates remains questionable. And it's actually full of bold claims, but incomplete information. So how could they have defeated them despite the odds? So one thing, a very important thing that was not mentioned in the video by Kings and Generals, because it was also missing, it was not mentioned in the two letters about the battle, was the role played by the native forces of the Philippines in aiding the Spaniards against the Japanese pirates. So unknown to many, including Filipinos, throughout the history of Spanish colonial Philippines, the vast majority of the Spanish forces in the islands were not actually Spaniards. They were not even Europeans. They were in fact natives and indigenous to the islands. For the most part, it was said that the Spanish forces in the Philippines was made up of about 3/4 Kapampangan warriors. It was believed that for every Spanish soldier in the islands, there was about 3 Kapampangans. And this was true especially in the early parts of Spanish colonialism in Southeast Asia. And in many cases, their valor and contributions in the many battles fought in Asia were often minimized, if not totally ignored, or worse, forgotten in the mainstream narrative and official history of the Philippines. An example of this would be the historic battles of La Naval de Manila between the Dutch and the Spaniards in the 1600s, in which Spain emerged victorious. It's almost the same thing. They said that only a handful of Spanish galleons won over dozens of Dutch warships, that only, a few Spanish soldiers won over hundreds of Dutch soldiers. But what is often ignored is the unknown number of Kapampangan warships, indigenous warships called Virais and Caracoas, that also formed the Kapampangan fleet that aided the Spaniards against the Dutch. They also ignored the hundreds of Kapampangan bayani or warriors aboard these indigenous warships. In other words, the native Kapampangans of Luzon won this victory, but Spain took the credit. And yes, for those who are wondering, even after Luzon was colonized by the Spaniards in the 1570s, the Kapampangans were actually allowed to retain and keep their trading and naval fleet. In fact, they kept trading directly and independently with the Japanese up to the 17th century. Unknown to many, the Kapampangans of Luzon traded highly demanded commodities to Japan, such as indigo, beeswax, and even deerskin that the Japanese used to make armors for the samurai. Like I said, there's so much more to learn about this forgotten history and relations between our ancestors and the Japanese. And yes, we can talk more about this in future videos. I also made a video about the epic battles of La Naval a few years ago, so check it out in the links up here or down below to learn more. Now, how exactly do we know that the native forces actually helped the Spaniards against the Japanese pirates in Aparri back in 1842? Ay, mali. 1582. How do we know that they actually helped the Spaniards drive away the pirates in Aparri during the Battle of Cagayan in 1582? The short and simple answer is that this has been done many times before. This was not the first time that the natives helped the Spaniards drive away pirates. And examples of this, epic examples of this, happened during the invasions of legendary pirates, like the one led by Limahong in the 1570s and the one led by Koxinga in the 1660s. In both of these epic battles between the Spaniards and the legendary pirates, the warriors of Luzon were actually instrumental in defeating and driving out the pirate invaders. Again, it was because of the native warriors that the Spaniards won. But wait, what about in Aparri in 1582? They were not actually mentioned in the two letters. Actually, if you look at other sources beyond the two letters about the Battle of Cagayan, other sources point to the fact that in the early 1580s, the Visayan, Tagalog, and Kapampangan warriors were given land to settle and cultivate in the Cagayan Valley. These lands were given as a compensation or a reward for, their valor in successfully driving out the Japanese pirates from northern Luzon. In fact, fun fact, it was also these Visayan, Kapampangan, and Tagalog warriors who were given land in Cagayan were actually the ones who introduced the making of Nipa wine to the people of Cagayan. And today, Cagayan is actually famous for their own local Nipa wine industry. So if you ask me, the reason why the Spaniards successfully defeated hundreds of Japanese Woku pirates in the Battle of Cagayan in Aparri back in 1582 was, despite the odds, was because they were aided by the fierce warriors from the Visayas and the valiant Kapampangan and Tagalog warriors of Luzon. But sadly, these were left out in the two Spanish letters and thus forgotten in the mainstream narrative of history. And one more thing worth mentioning, an important thing that a lot of Filipinos today are unaware of, was the fact that our pre-colonial ancestors already had their own advanced weaponry before colonialism. We already had our own firearms, such as guns and cannons, and our own indigenous navies before we were colonized by the Spaniards. Many today were raised to believe that it was the Spaniards who introduced firearms to our people. But the truth is, our ancestors were not backward, ignorant savages before colonialism, as is often depicted in the mainstream narrative of Philippine history in the last 500 years. From the Visayans who raided the coast of China in the 1100s to the Luzones warriors in the many wars of Southeast Asia in the 1500s and 1600s. And we must also not forget that the Sultanates of Sulu and Maguindanao successfully prevented the Spaniards from colonizing Mindanao from the 1500s to the 1800s, and not to mention how the Spaniards never successfully subjugated the indigenous people of the Cordilleras in the north and the indigenous Lumans of the south. Our ancestors, the diverse people of what is now the Philippines, were not weak. They were not the primitive little brown monkeys we were often made to see in the colonial miseducation of our people. In fact, the Spaniards themselves recognized the skills of our ancestors and took advantage of our indigenous warriors and our indigenous navies. Actually, not just the Spaniards. For example, even the Portuguese sought the alliance of our pre-colonial Luzones ancestors. But of course, these were often left out. They were often pushed out of the spotlight. But nevertheless, it is not too late for us to dig deeper and learn more. Like I said many times before, there's so much more that we can learn about our ancestors from our own ancestors. About the history, the culture, of our diverse people and beautiful islands. And that is it for me today. But of course, before we go, today's shoutout goes to Joseph Malina from the Cagayan Valley in the Philippines, Aminuddin Fami from Malaysia, Dalfi Fran from Indonesia, Haruki from Japan, and special shoutout to my patron, Nolan Agamata from California. And of course, special thanks to all my patrons throughout these years. Dakala salamat, terima kasih, arigato, agyaman for all your love and support. And actually, speaking of my patrons, this month of October, Filipino-American History Month, I'll be hosting a special meet and greet and virtual hangout with all of my patrons. So if you want to help me make more videos like this and join our future hangouts, show your support and please be my patron. And you can also show your support to my channel by getting copies of any of my books or coloring books or any of the merch linked down below. Maraming salamat po. Arigato, terima kasih, daghang salamat, agyaman, dakalpong salamat. See you next time, or in Tagalog kita kits, and in Kapampangan, Mikitex, and in Japanese, Matane.